Page 94, the Private Eye Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Page 94. My name is Andrew Hunter-Murray, and this week we have a special Schools Out Forever edition about the schools that will be closing down after the summer holidays and the reasons why. We'll also be talking to Private Eye's technology correspondent Matt Muir about Facebook and its recent woes. But first, education. Now, most school pupils will be going back to their schools this autumn, but not all of them will. Lots of schools will have shut down, and lots of others will have changed hands. And the whole reason for this is due to the very complicated and bizarre nature of the school system these days, and particularly the new kinds of school that the government has introduced. So, I'm sure you're all familiar with standard comprehensive schools that are run by the local education authority. However, there are also grammar schools, there are free schools, there are private schools, and the schools that we're most focused on today are academies. Now, those are a new kind of school introduced by the last Labour government, and they are funded directly by the Department for Education, so they are independent of any local authority control. Academies are frequently run by bodies called multi-academy trusts. Now, these are chains of academies that operate all over the country. Some multi-academy trusts run just one school, others run multiple schools. Some operate in just one part of the country, others are all over the place. And when a multi-academy trust fails, all the schools in that particular chain are handed over to another one. Now, schools can be shut down because they're doing badly, but in the context of education, that can mean a few different things. Here is Jane McKenzie of The Eye explaining a little more.
So a school could be doing badly academically, it could do poorly at an Ofsted report, or it could be doing badly financially. They could have an enormous deficit and somebody else will have to come in to deal with that problem. In fact, a multi-academy trust can collapse, some of them have, and all the schools within the trust have to find new trusts to take them over. And not all of them will, because some of the reasons why they've lost all their money will still be there and nobody will want them.
Is it, for example, if they've signed a very bad PFI deal and they're going to be running an enormous deficit because they'll owe someone lots of money for decades?
Yes, or just really catastrophically bad buildings.
Right.
So there's an immediate sort of massive spending drain there. They don't want to take that risk on.
So you get schools which are kind of basket cases because no new trust wants to take them on. They look at it and they think, there's no way we can make this financially viable.
Yeah, or they don't have enough pupils. Small schools are more expensive to run.
Because of economies of scale and that kind of thing?
Exactly that. You only need to employ one head teacher for your big school. You still need to employ someone on a head teacher's salary at your small school.
Okay, so you're getting these often smaller schools which can't find anywhere to take them on. What happens then? Do they just close?
Many are doing, yes.
Where does that leave all the pupils and the parents of that school? They have to scramble for places in the immediate area?
And of course, if you're in a more remote area, what you're doing is adding horrible amounts of travel to children's day, where they have to now take a bus to the next village or the next village after that, or where the next village where there's still a school.
And where presumably there's space to take you
them
on.
In, yes.
This doesn't seem like a sane way of running an educational policy.
No, it's something we've been mentioning in The Eye for some time. One of the major problems with introducing free schools was they were set up where somebody wanted to set up a school.
Right, yes, and the principle behind the free schools was that parents and local interested parties could just set up their own schools, even if they were in an area with schools in it already.
Even if they were in an area with too many schools in already. In an area where they were having to make decisions about which schools were going to be closed down because there weren't enough pupils to make up the schools. People were allowed to open extra schools.
I mean, was there any reasoning behind that?
Because some people really fancied opening a school.
But that's mad. Obviously, that can't be the reason.
Well, it's hard to find what other reason there was for some of these schools. Somebody really just, their heart was set upon a new school, so they got to have one.
And the principle in introducing the legislation to allow people to just set up free schools, the idea that the market, if you like, will provide schools where they're needed.
Yes.
Was that the philosophy
was the
behind
argument that
it?
was put.
Okay.
That there were people who would clearly do a terrific job of setting up a school, or they wouldn't, and then it would fail. You'd then eventually get to a position where you'd have some good schools.
But what you seem to be saying now is that in these, for example, remote areas where a school is shut down because it's not affordable or because the buildings are in a poor condition or whatever it might be, it's actually quite hard to find a group of parents willing to build a school.
Yes, there's plenty of places where nobody's driving passion is to open a school. They've got other jobs.
They've got jobs already.
Other hobbies.
Yeah. One thing that you've written recently is that schools are likely to improve if they stay under the control of an LEA. Once they've had a bad report from Ofsted, for example, there are figures that show that it's better to stay under LEA than to go to a multi-academy trust.
Yes. What's sort of come out in recent figures is that there's absolutely no evidence that converting a school to an academy because it was doing badly helped in any way. In fact, the opposite. If they'd stayed with the local authority, then a local authority had things like school improvement schemes that they could push at a school that had been proven to need it. It's impossible to argue that it's been awful everywhere. It's not. There are good trusts who are doing a terrific job because their teachers are doing a terrific job and their managers are doing a terrific job, and there's nothing about academies that forces things to be run poorly.
Yeah.
But it allows things to be run poorly.
And we've spoken briefly there about free schools, but the fact is that, as you've said, free schools can close down.
Yeah.
Which creates hassle for parents and pupils, even in areas where there are enough schools, let alone where there aren't.
Yes. And it also leaves empty buildings, which money's been spent on. So there's various schools that were set up as free schools or studio schools or university technical colleges where sort of lovely new buildings were created with science labs and sports halls, and there's nobody using them because they were built in the wrong place with the wrong specialisms and not useful.
Let's talk about these studio schools and university technical colleges, because those are more school innovations, aren't they? Those are more types of school that the government introduced recently.
Yes. They were very much focused on tackling the sort of 14 to 19-year-old end of education, with a sort of argument that's been sort of running for a long time as to whether we need some more technical education, stop pushing everybody at academics. There should be different education for sort of different approaches. So the idea with the studio schools and the university technical colleges was to have industry very involved in sort of pushing the skills that a particular industry needed. For instance, up on the northwest coast near Sellafield, there's a, sort of a massive need for people doing physics and engineering and that kind of thing. And a sort of odd idea that other schools would just sort of funnel their pupils out at 14 and send them off to somewhere else where they could specialise.
Did that not happen?
Funnily enough, schools don't like to get rid of their best and brightest. So those pupils who were likely to do really well in the sciences were largely encouraged to do their academic sciences and stay in the schools. So what the studio schools found was they ended up with people who weren't particularly interested in doing their specialisms or they didn't end up with any pupils at all.
So I think you wrote recently that in 2017, 60 free schools, university technical colleges and studio schools closed, and that had a cumulative cost of £140 million.
Yes. I mean, that's just the sort of cumulative cost of, having set up schools that aren't useful. I mean, the sort of the cost to the pupils themselves is sort of not included in the finances, but having your education messed about like that is a sort of lifelong cost of missed opportunity.
Do you think there is anything that could simplify the system and reduce some of these inefficiencies and some of these seemingly systematic errors in the way we're running education?
Well, I think what would massively help would be to stop kind of basing your education planning on having grand and exciting big wow ideas of we'll invent a new system of providing this kind of specialist thing here and this sort of market-free thing here and this sort of big new idea there, and just plan to have education available for pupils.
That sounds like a good innovation, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's one more thing I wanted to ask you about, which is the salaries in Academy Trusts, which you've been covering.
Oh, yes.
And some of them are quite high, I believe.
Yes, one of the things that becoming an academy allowed schools to do was to set their own salaries for senior staff.
I can't see anything going wrong here.
Well, some of them took advantage of this. Some of the more famous cases, like the Durand School, where salaries escalated quite spectacularly, we covered for some time.
And it's interesting because there's no relation between the number of schools that an Academy Trust is running and the remuneration for those at the top. Sir Dan Moynihan is the highest paid multi-academy trust chief. He's being paid £440,000.
Yeah.
But he's running 44 schools.
Yeah. So per school,
yeah,
he's reasonably effective.
Okay.
Yeah.
But as you pointed out, there are 29 trusts around the country which are paying their chiefs £150,000 or more,
yeah.
and they've only got one school each, these
yes.
trusts.
So on a sort of...
on the Moynihan scale.
On the Moynihan scale, they're not nearly as good value.
And that just seems to be completely out of whack all over the country. There's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no standard, well, you're running 5 to 10 schools, so you should probably be in this bracket, because that's a lot of responsibility. Or you're only running one school, which requires less, perhaps, and therefore means a slightly lower pay packet.
Yes, it's a very much a weird question of what the market will bear.
And just to reiterate, this is money that's coming through a quango.
Yeah.
And is there no oversight of this procedure?
There is, and this is one of the issues where occasionally academies, trusts fail on a financial level for the governance of their remuneration decisions.
Simply put, they've been paying too many people too much money.
Yes.
And as a result, little Jimmy has to find somewhere else 3 villages over to go to school.
To go to school.
Jane Mackenzie. Now, staying with education, Solomon Hughes writes a great deal for Private Eye about the revolving door between government and big business. That applies not only to big business, but also to big education. Here's Solomon.
Well, I mean, the current story is just that I noticed that somebody who was a regional schools commissioner, which is a story in itself, had left the Department for Education, where the regional school commissioners live, and joined a multi-academy trust. Jane Wilson, who's the Deputy Regional Schools Commissioner for the North, and she'd become the Deputy Chief Executive of the Northern Education Trust.
OK, so a Deputy Schools Commissioner, that might be something that needs a bit of unpacking for the listeners.
What's it all mean? What's happened with the academies is there's a whole new architecture of how education works. And I don't think many parents understand this. I don't think many people just walking down the street understand this. They still assume if they see a local school, it's probably run by the local education authority, and they would imagine if something went wrong, you could either write to the school or write to the council. That's not the case. If a school has been taken out of the education authority and handed over to a multi-academy trust, they are in charge, they get the money, they run the school. The only connection they have then with the taxpayer that funds it ultimately is not through the local education authority, it's through the Department for Education. So on the one hand, you've broken up schools, they're all run by these trusts, but on the other hand, you centralised it straight to the Department of Education. But they run this through these people, regional schools commissioners.
OK, so there'll be a few for each region of the country, and they will, in what sense are they exerting control over the schools?
Well, if a school is being told to go into an academy, they'll decide which one. Once it's gone into an academy, they will meet regularly with the academy and say, your schools are doing well, your schools are doing badly, you need to improve, you need to not improve.
Okay.
And sometimes they will take a school out of one academy trust. They can't go back to the Education Authority. It's a one-way street. Once you leave the Education Authority, once you leave that public sector, if you like, you can never go back. It's a sort of Hotel California situation. You check in, you can never leave. But you can be sent, rebrokered, they call it, to another academy. And again, the Regional Schools Commissioner would do that.
OK, so the commissioners are kind of the governmental controllers on the ground for these multi-academy trusts,
yes.
Which might, as Jane has said, might be spread all over the country.
They might, yeah, and they find ways to try and deal with that. So a regional schools commissioner for the North would have to deal with academy trusts that have schools in the North, but that same academy trust might have schools in the South. Well, the regional schools commissioner for the South would have to deal with those.
OK. So you were saying that it's all been centralised.
Yes.
So you're getting your money directly from the government.
Yes.
Rather than it being filtered through the local education authority, which is the old way of doing things.
Yes.
Is there a chance that that might have some advantages, getting the money directly from government? Is there a way, perhaps, that things might be standardised? Or
Well, I mean, they haven't done that at all. I mean, it's all a bit anarchic to my mind, because each multi-academy trust runs in a completely different way. There's very weak control. I mean, partly just because, if you've got whatever a dozen regional schools commissioners, they can't possibly deal with this level of complexity. So it's a very broad brush. And, of course, this is the big worry. This is why the revolving door thing came up for me, is if the person who's supposed to be commissioning multi-academy trusts to run schools, if the person who's supposed to be commissioning them then leaves and gets what I assume to be a better paid job at the multi-academy trust, they're not going to bear down that hard on them. If you're the person who's supposed to be buying for the taxpayer, I'm going to go and buy these educational services, then go and works with the supplier, that's a bad sign. And in this case, and we've come across this before, the Deputy Regional Schools Commissioner went to work for a multi-academy trust that had many schools that require improvement, and indeed 5 that were inadequate. So it was a poorly performing one. Now, that's really someone they should have been saying, you shouldn't be running schools. You're running schools that are inadequate. You're running schools that require improvement. We're giving you all this money. They're giving the Northern Education Trust, roughly speaking, £90 million a year, and they're not doing a good job. Really, the argument should be, to my mind, go away. Maybe we'll give the schools back to the local education authority and let them have another try. But in the modern system, that can't work. Instead, they'll hang on to their schools, they'll negotiate it. Maybe they'll be taken off them and to give another trust, but they do have the advantage of having a former Regional Schools Commissioner working for them.
So, to anyone who didn't know about multi-academy trust until this podcast started, this is all quite bewildering and new, but the basic point is schools are being put in large private chains across the country, which are non-profit, but the people who are supposed to be the watchdogs of these large chains of schools are frequently going off and working for chains of schools, which should be in their sphere of influence, meaning that might affect slightly their incentive to have that watchdog function. And it's something that you write about a great deal.
Indeed.
And it's very surprising it's happening in education now, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't start out looking at this from the point of view of being, an education correspondent at Private Eye. We have our education covered by Jane Mackenzie, who you've been speaking to. I was just writing about big contracts, and then these things were flashing up on the normal way I look at big contracts being a bit, to my mind, a bit of a rip-off. I've got some warning lights, systems that I look at, and it started to be that schools were looking at that.
So what are the warning lights in your system?
Well, revolving door would be one. The other would be if the National Audit Office has done a big report and found some money gone. The third would be that you have to look at institutions by company accounts, and when you look at company accounts, things don't look right, and all of those became issues for schools. So that kind of thing.
So the National Audit Office, has there been a report by the National Audit Office?
Yes, the National Audit Office, they did some work, and the Education Select Committee used some of their work. So in this case, the Education Select Committee's report was a bit more useful. And what they found was that since 2010-11, £745 million has been spent converting schools to academies.
So that's just on the conversions as opposed to on the schools themselves?
Yeah, it's not the ongoing cost. That's how much it costs to go from an local education authority system to one where I think it's in secondary schools. It's approaching half of the schools are academies now. So that's a big lot of money being spent to make this change. And then what the Education Select Committee did, this is their most recent report, is they asked the department, can you say how that's improved schools? And they found that the Department for Education could not prove, I quote this, could not prove whether converting underperforming schools to academies had been better value for money than leaving them as maintained schools. Maintained in this case means run by the local education authority in their way.
So there's no proven benefit to multi-academy trusts from an educational point of view?
No, the DFE said, well, we can't prove it because they have changed, so, we don't know what would happen if they didn't.
So you couldn't run a control school. You can't simultaneously have a school being maintained and in a trust.
It was belief. I mean, actually, to be honest, the public accounts. Sorry, that last quote was from the Public Accounts Committee, which rather than the Education Select Committee. I'll get my two reports mixed up. But the Public Accounts Committee, which is informed by the National Audit Office, they said the checks that the department carries out before schools convert to academies have not prevented a succession of high-profile academy failures. So we have seen failures. We may have seen success, but the Department for Education couldn't quantify it. They thought there probably was, but they weren't sure. But considering, it's a policy that they're ideologically committed to, well, they don't see the bad side of it. They willfully don't see the bad side of it.
One thing Jane and I were talking about was the fact that schools which are perhaps slightly harder to run, so rural schools, they may not be snapped up by multi-academy trusts because they might be harder to run, there might be fewer pupils, they might be more remote, so you're going to have higher costs per head. And as a result, much like health services, which are difficult to run, people with very complex conditions, as opposed to very simple operations, the very simple operations are the ones which get snapped up.
Cherry picking,
exactly.
There's not been enough criticism of the programme, partly because...
The Academy programme.
Partly because it was instituted by Labour, so it's a very new Labour thing, but in the new Labour conception it was a small number of academy schools to kind of ginger up the education system, and it's Nicky Morgan, Conservative Education Secretary of a few goes back, who expanded it massively and said we're going to have... First, she said we're going to have all schools will become academies, and then she kind of backtracked a bit and really backtracked to the point of most. And because it was initially a Labour policy, that means that Labour have been a bit slow to criticise it. Obviously, with the kind of Labour no longer being New Labour, they're now more openly critical, but it's taken them a while. I think you can see in both conceptions, but more clearly in the current conception, the main urge is to break the local education authorities. They did not like local control of schools.
Why not?
To my mind, because local control of schools is a democratic one which you base on the idea of people voting, people raising money locally, and so on and so forth. So generally speaking, you'd have a pressure of if you've got lots of people who've got kids at school, they vote to have higher spending on schools. If you do it through the DFE, it's easier to have not just lower spending on schools, but a certain way of spending on schools. You definitely have seen the multi-academy trusts tend to have high salaries at the top, poorer salaries for teachers, and less mix of teachers, less career progression for teachers.
Can I pick you up on that? Because these multi-academy trusts are not-for-profit organisations, I think you said. But they are allowed to set very high salaries at the top, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, you've got two features. I mean, what they can do, well, more or less, up until there's kind of a Wild West, they could do what they wanted, and they tended to be run rather by businessmen than educationalists, so they tended to run not for profit, but on business lines. And on business lines in the modern conception means you give the chief executive loads and you give the poor bloody infantry less. That just is the modern management method. And you definitely had that. You've got, I think, a lot of the multi-academy trusts, say running 20 schools or something like that, you might see salaries of around, they're not enormous, but they're big, £200,000 type salaries. In the highest case, which I think was Harris Federation, it was approaching £500,000. And initially, everyone just ignored this. I think the educational press were quite good at picking up on this, but not necessarily the rest of the press, because it meant going through the accounts of every one of these organisations, and they finally started putting together lists of the high salaries at the top. And the line that's drawn, I think, is more than the Prime Minister. That's the kind of measure which is like, 150 grand-ish. Once you get more than the Prime Minister, people go, that's not right. How can somebody be running 20 schools be paid more than the Prime Minister? I think the Prime Minister likes this because they're always hoping that, they'll increase their salary, but it never quite works that way. And so there is now pressure from the Department for Education to cut down the salaries. But when I say that, pressure, they're paying the money. Why not just say, put down the salary or we're cutting the money? That would be a simple way of doing it. These people they're not the equivalent of head teachers, they're the equivalent of the head of a small local education authority, but they are paid way more than those people. So high salaries at the top, and I think worse conditions for teachers, tending to also less classroom assistants and so on and so forth.
So it might lead to worse conditions in schools. It doesn't lead to administrative efficiency.
Not in my view. Obviously, if you're an enthusiast for a multi-academy trust, you'll say, well, what you're doing is by bringing new entrants, competition, you're shaking up an old, staid and stodgy system that was unresponsive. I should acknowledge that that's what they say, even if I don't believe it for a minute. But So they can run on more businessy lines, sometimes cranky. I mean, sometimes it would be just some funny educational cranky idea. Oh, well, let's all just introduce more Latin, or that's not made up, that actually happens, or let's introduce more physical jerks, or so there's kind of, not that I'm against either Latin or physical jerks, or even combining the two, but I'm just saying they tend to have these sort of cranky enthusiasm, this will be it. So there might be that, might be just more on sort of businessy lines, it might be new efficiencies, it might be all kind of things. So, but none of them really grounded, I think, in standard educational practice, which is another attraction, particularly for the Conservative government and to some extent for the new Labour government, because they thought established educational practice was somehow left-wing, or the blob, isn't it? That's what
that was Gove's
name
used
to
for
call
the
it, the blob.
educational establishment.
And the blob, on the one hand, means a giant science fiction monster that eats everything before it, but it was also a metaphor drawn from an American Republican who said it was a kind of giant communist science fiction monster that devours all before it. And Gove was serious about that. He did describe the educational blob as Marxist enemies of promise. So he did think sort of teacher training, organisations, educational authorities, the schools unions were some kind of red menace, and breaking them up by introducing boards of your mates probably has its attractions.
So if you have a body of people running a multi-academy trust, does that lead in any ways to further commercialisation of the sector?
Yes, I think it does. I think the key here is the two-word phrase, related transactions. The multi-academy trusts aren't profit-making, but they can give business to other profit-making bodies. This was always inherent. Lord O'Shaughnessy, who's now a health minister actually, but he back in 2012 he was just writing policy papers, and he said we must put more schools into academies. They have to go into what he called academy chains, because single academies can't do it, and these multi-academy chains, they shouldn't be profit-making, but they can themselves give work to profit-making bodies to bring a bit more market in it. He said that in 2012, and that's exactly what's happened. And we'll go back to that phrase, related transactions. If you look in the accounts, if a multi-academy trust gives money to businesses which are related to its own board, it has to list them. And again, we've seen scandals where multi-academy trusts, they've had somebody on the board who also runs an educational business or a office services business, and the multi-academy trust has given loads of money to people on the board's own businesses.
So, for example, if I'm on the board of a school, I happen to run a big school bus company.
Exactly.
Then suddenly that bus company might find itself hoovering up that money.
Exactly.
And that all has to be declared on the trusts.
Well, it has to be. The sort of accounting rules is something called, if you have a related transaction, transaction with someone related to someone who's on the board or a trustee, you have to list it. They haven't always listed it as clearly as they should do, but they have generally followed the rules, and that's where we've really found quite serious scandals. The trusts have been found paying hundreds of thousands of pounds to businesses run by their own people on their own board or relatives of people on their own board, and it's been very, very embarrassing. Some multi-academy trusts have had to close as a consequence, but I think all that's happened is the really outrageous ones have been caught rather than the general drift, which, like I say, from one point of view has always been inherent. It's always been the idea these won't be profit-making institutions, but they can then get involved in the market, give more money out. So you have seen a flow of taxpayers' money going to various forms of educational suppliers via the trusts on a bigger scale than what we've seen before.
It's kind of like the janitor having a cleaning products firm on the side, which he then flogs to everyone in the school.
Yes, but it's not usually the janitor, is it? It's usually the director, isn't it? Do you know what? We need some new windows. You know, my brother-in-law runs a very interesting window firm. And, I don't know whether they do need new windows so quickly. I think we need more chalk. I don't know, windows. Bring the light in on the pupils.
Solomon Hughes. Now, Facebook. Facebook has absolutely been through the ringer this year. Despite being one of the world's largest companies, it's been mired in scandal, it's been stumbling from crisis to crisis, and the most recent headlines involved Facebook stock being down over 20% after the company announced earnings that fell dramatically short of the rest of the market's expectations. To try and unpack all this and explain whether the most recent news has any bearing on Facebook's longer-term future, here is The Eye's technology correspondent, Matt Muir.
So that was effectively Facebook's most recent quarterly earnings report, where they talk about the business to the market and analysts, which saw over $100 billion wiped off the stock price within a few hours after the announcement, mainly based on revised earnings projections. They suggested that rather than a double-digit figure of earnings or profit growth over the next few quarters, they were instead revising that to be single-digit growth rather than double-digit growth, and the market reacted catastrophically, as occasionally happens in these instances.
I mean, Facebook growing by single digits as opposed to double digits doesn't sound like anything to cry about, especially.
I mean, were I Mark Zuckerberg, which I'm self-evidently not, I would probably not be crying into my soya latte right now. But it did lead to a succession of increasingly febrile headlines around the world. Is this the end for Facebook? Is this a backlash against the recent questions over their model, about the propriety of the platform, about their approach to, inverted commas, fake news, and other such things? In reality, I think the question is somewhat more complicated than that, and probably nowhere near as bad for Facebook as some analysts might have wanted to make out.
How bad is it then?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, they're failing to grow users in the same way as they have been for the past few years. The main rationale for that, on the other hand, is that they're sort of running out of new human beings to tempt onto the platform. If you consider the penetration in the US market alone for adults, that is the over 18s, is somewhere in the 90s% in the US, you sort of start to realize that whatever they do, there aren't that many people alive in the world, at least in the West, that they can get onto Facebook and sell advertising against, which obviously means that, you know, there is a ceiling to its potential growth. That said, there's an awful lot of people in India, Africa, potentially even China, who knows, who are still blissfully unaware of the magic of Facebook and who could still be enticed onto it via a variety of means. So I'd suggest that whilst in the West growth may be starting to plateau, there's still a lot of opportunity elsewhere.
Okay. Can you talk a bit more about these problems that have led to this downgrading of expected growth?
So part of it was the drop in users. Another part of it has been a drop in the number of users clicking on ads, which some analysts suggest is down to Facebook beginning to clamp down slightly on certain types of advertising. The much vaunted attempt to stop bad actors, as they term it, influencing... I know, bad actors, it's a lovely phrase, isn't it?
Yeah.
It puts you in mind of Sunday Rep or something like that. So certain analysts have commented that potentially is a factor. And then, there's a general lack of market confidence, or at least perceived popular confidence around the platform, which, I mean, I don't know about you. Do you know anyone who's actually left Facebook in the last 6 months?
Do you know, I don't think so.
Despite the fact that everyone hates it, nobody enjoys being on there, and everyone thinks it's generally a bad thing.
Yeah.
And still, people persist in using it and blithely giving it access to all of the data about themselves that they need to make money.
So, is it a problem, for example, if people just start using it less?
It depends for whom. I mean, if you consider that people use Facebook less, then potentially that's a problem for Facebook, up until the point you realise that Facebook also owns Instagram and WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, all of which are now separate platforms, all of which are owned by the same company. Now, if you consider that young people, as has been repeatedly said over the past couple of years, increasingly abandoning Facebook, or even in many cases not using it at all and skipping directly to another network, one could potentially see that as problematic. However, all of those young people are going to Instagram, owned by Facebook, using the same advertising platform as Facebook does. And one of the things that Facebook has been so clever about, and one of the reasons why I think they're in a very, very strong position, I'd still be quite bullish about them as a stock, is that effectively, whilst you might not want to advertise on Facebook, you might still want to advertise on Instagram. WhatsApp, they haven't even started to monetize properly yet, although they made some moves towards that in an announcement they made last week about charging businesses for certain parts of the service. Similarly, Facebook Messenger, it has adverts on it, but it's relatively under-monetized. But the point is that all of that is still money that flows through Facebook. The cash is still going to them. Fundamentally, Mark Zuckerberg is still sitting on a gigantic pile of dollars that he's playing with Scrooge McDuck-like, I imagine, in his spare time.
I have the sense that WhatsApp is a safer app than Facebook because the messages on it are encrypted. Is there any truth to that at all?
I mean, that's entirely true. WhatsApp is it's almost impossible to hack externally, which makes it an incredibly useful communications platform for all sorts of people, whether it be activists, political dissidents, and it is a good thing within those terms. What's also interesting about WhatsApp, as I said previously, is that at the moment no one can advertise at you based on your activity on it. I would be amazed if that weren't to change in the not-too-distant future. It feels almost inevitable that there's going to be a degree. As I said earlier, the business side of it is starting to be monetized. It would surprise me significantly were you not to start seeing adverts crop up in between your messages at some point in the next few years.
So, what you're saying is that Facebook aren't really in too much trouble.
I think it's easy to overstate the amount of trouble that they're in. There's no argument that people are significantly less well disposed to it than they were a few years ago, and people weren't that well disposed to it a few years ago. But it's like any semi-public utility these days. It's like the trains. No one likes the trains. No one thinks they're good. Everyone thinks that something should be changed with the trains and they need to be fixed. Everyone, however, needs the trains. They're infrastructurally significant. And we're now getting to a point where, for a significant coterie of people in the Western world, Facebook is infrastructurally vital. There was a lot of talk around the time of April, May, with the great furore about electoral interference and political advertising, Cambridge Analytica and various associated things, about deleting Facebook, and about the fact that actually to do that requires a certain degree of privilege. For lots and lots of people, Facebook is a genuinely essential part of their day-to-day life in terms of their ability to connect with people, to make professional and personal interactions, to be able to organise, to coalesce around particular issues. And to take that away suddenly strips and denudes people of an awful lot of agency that is particularly personally and professionally useful to them. And so it's not like everyone can just step back and stop using it all of a sudden. Until something else steps up that fulfills the same degree of function and has the same sort of mass adoption that Facebook has, because all of these networks are only as useful as the network of people that's on them to any single individual. Until something springs up to replace it, it's not going anywhere. And for that reason alone, I'd be very, very surprised to see it suffer any significant user base issues beyond those which we're already seeing over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. Although obviously that's the sort of stupid prediction that's going to make me look like a real idiot in 3 years' time when it doesn't exist anymore.
Matt, I do have to say, we're coming close to sounding positive about Facebook, and we don't sound positive about anything on this podcast.
I still hate it.
Right.
Don't get me wrong. I don't have it on my phone for a reason.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
Oh, God, no.
Why not?
Well, because I don't want to tell it everything about me. I tell it enough as it is. I don't need it to know everywhere I am at all times. The amount of data that's gathered by the app when it's installed on a phone, as with many, many other apps, of course, almost unknowingly, obviously we all sign the terms and conditions and agree to them without ever paying the slightest bit of attention as to what's in them. We give away an incredible amount of information, and I personally would prefer not to do that as much as is possible.
To go back briefly to the Cambridge Analytica stuff, the misuse of data stories that were enormous in May. In fact, Carol Cadwalladr of The Observer was nominated for the Paul Foot Award as a result of her investigation into that and other things. To what extent has that had an effect, and to what extent is that going to be acted on, if at all? Because all we know is that a committee of MPs are looking into the matter, and in the nicest possible way, it's not a huge parliamentary effort that's being made, obviously, because it's an under-resourced effort.
What's interesting about this is that even before, I mean, Carol's been reporting on this obviously for 18 months now. In fact, she started getting interested in this issue around about the time of the election in 2017. I remember she was writing articles about the power of dark advertising that the Tories were going to use to sweep all before them. As we know, it didn't quite turn out like that, which sheds one or two questions, or casts one or two questions on the effectiveness of some of this advertising in the first place. But the point about her investigation and the fabulous journalism contained therein was, in my opinion at least, less about Facebook than it was about the fundamental inadequacy of the laws governing political advertising in this country and elsewhere. What's interesting is that Facebook had already, before March, April, when the story broke big time, they'd already taken steps to start to address this. They announced in October of last year that all ads deemed political would be open and transparent. Thereby, anybody on the platform could go onto any page on Facebook, and a page is what you require to be able to operate advertising, to go onto any page on Facebook and see the adverts that page had been running. All of the ads, regardless of whether or not you might have been targeted with them. And if they were political adverts, you would also be able to see the type of targeting that was applied. So you'd be able to see the brackets, the buckets of people which the advertiser had used to target said advertising. Now, that's been live in the US for a few months now, and they also trialled a version of it for the Irish referendum earlier this year. And what's become signally apparent in the brief period that they've been doing that is that Facebook really doesn't know what a political ad is. And that's really hard. It's a qualitative value judgment to a certain extent. And obviously there are adverts from official political parties that you can very easily say, yes, fine, that's from the Conservative Party, that's a political advert, that's from the Greens, that's a political advert. On the other hand, a campaign group? Now, to what extent would that be determined political? Where do you draw the line? And the difficulty with this that Facebook have found already in the US is that they've started clamping down on what they perceive to be bad political adverts. Any advert in the US that they term to be or they deem to be political has to be directly approved by Facebook to a greater degree of scrutiny than it would do otherwise. And this has seen lots of adverts by charities, for example, in the US being banned because they fall under the definition of political, and Facebook doesn't deem them to be the right sort of political advert. Now, that's obviously hugely problematic going forward. If you consider Facebook, for better or worse, being one of the great campaigning tools of our age, which it is. I mean, the fact that a small charity can use a relatively tiny budget to promote itself and to gain funding from potential supporters all around the world, vastly, vastly powerful. To suddenly start to restrict that ability is dangerous, potentially. And I don't like slippery slope arguments, but one could argue there's a slight slippery slope argument here if one wanted to make it.
Do you?
I think what this points to is a broader issue with Facebook not wanting to set itself up as a publisher for reasons that lots and lots of people have discussed. You know, if you're a publisher, you have to take responsibility for the content on your platform, whereas if you're just a platform, you can devolve responsibility to the people publishing.
Do you think that's at the root of all this?
This is the fundamental question and the fundamental difficulty that Facebook is facing, as are all other. Social media is a term I don't particularly like using, but social media platforms, for the sake of it, they all face the same issue, admittedly, because Facebook owns 4 of the 10 most popular in the world. It faces this issue to a greater extent than anybody else. But Snapchat is also looking into algorithmic ways to combat fake news, for example, as are all of the other ones around the world. I mean, I won't list them, but there are 3 or 4 others globally that are of moderately significant size, and they're all grappling with this issue and to determine how they position themselves and to what extent can they create this chimerical new type of entity that is half platform, half publisher? Platfisher, maybe? Can we coin that? Is that a word?
I think we can, yeah.
Okay, great. We'll trademark it now.
Do you have much hope that it's going to happen, that these organisations will start taking responsibility for the content published on them?
No, because there is, not without some sort of regulatory oversight to enforce this, simply because there is far too great a degree of liability for them financially, and from a shareholder value basis, I find it difficult to see how they would ever be able to push that through.
And so the final question is, if it's going to require some kind of regulatory change, what kind of a hope do you hold out for that?
I hold out about as much hope as I've held out in the past for anything on the internet being regulated well. If you look at the proliferation of stories that we've seen over the past 5 years around, the Amazon tax story is a perfect example. Amazon is not a new company. Amazon has been a terrifying juggernaut of commerce for many, many years, and we've not been able to regulate that adequately from the point of view of taxation. Keeping information or regulating information is one of the hardest jobs in all of government, and no one's able to do it properly, let alone on the internet.
That's a suitably bleak ending for the podcast. I think we've pulled it back. Thank you very much, Matt.
My pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Page 94. We will be back again soon with another one. If you've enjoyed this one, please do write a review of it on iTunes. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye.